Every wrestler wants to stand out from the pack. After all, in an industry where there's so much talent, it's not good enough to just be great. No, sometimes you have to be different if you want people to take notice of you. And while one way of making yourself seen is to win a title belt, even this doesn't always work out quite as planned. So that's why some performers have gone one step further and chosen to customize their belts, forever making them their own in the process. But what are the best examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today, so join us as we take a deep dive into custom belts, wrestling's greatest personalized titles. And if we're starting anywhere, we really should do so with one of the most notorious examples of this, as when John Cena decided to rebuild the WWE title in his name in 2005, he did so by creating the now infamous spinner belt. Of course, this was a decision which both delighted his younger fans and angered many of his older detractors in equal measure, as well. To the former, it was considered a fun and eye-catching design which they no doubt wanted to buy replicas of. For the latter, it was largely seen as sacrilege. But while we wouldn't go quite as far as to agree with that sentiment, we will at least concede that the design does take some getting used to, as with its spinning WWE logo right in the center, it looks more of a child's toy and less a top prize the top wrestlers in the world should be fighting over. That said, even if it wasn't always popular, such a move was at least in keeping with Cena's character, as he was someone taking the company back to the days of larger-than-life all-American superhero babyfaces such as Hulk Hogan. And the popularity of both him and his title design amongst the kids meant that it would hang around for almost a full decade thereafter, long after Big Match John had lost the belt and it had instead moved over to other figures such as Edge and CM Punk. In fact, it wasn't until 2013 that the whole thing was retired and a newly designed top strap was introduced in its place. And while at this point many hardcore fans and even wrestlers backstage were happy to see it go, there remained a contingent of the audience who grew up seeing this as their world title, and so they gave it a fond farewell as a result. But it wasn't as if this was the only time Cena had a spinner belt design, because before he even became world champion, he'd start off his run as United States champion on SmackDown in 2004. And it was at this point that he introduced the template for what was to come with the spinner version of the secondary belt. Yes, while it may not be as well remembered as what he did with the world title, Big Match John's US title was just as much of a signal as to where the future was going. What was that future? Well, a far kid-friendlier product post-Attitude Era, one which had more in common with the golden era of the 80s than it had with the edginess of the late 90s. And with Cena already clearly being positioned as the soon-to-be top star of the era by the time he won the United States title for the third time in 2004, it was the perfect moment to take him to the next level in fans' minds by having him get his own customized version of the strap. Of course, this one ended up being short-lived in the long run though, as after the champ lost the belt to Orlando Jordan in March of 2005, JBL and his cabinet would destroy it when they threw it in the trash can and set it on fire. But even if this was a symbolic beginning of the end for Cena's Doctor of Thugonomics character, it only led to bigger things in the long run, because less than a year after that, he'd be WWE champion and would have started shifting towards his more familiar hustle, loyalty, and respect gimmick. And from there, you all know what happened. He became the top star of his generation and eventually introduced the aforementioned world title spinner belt. That said, this still wasn't the last variation on such a design. No, in an attempt to rub salt in the wound when he beat Big Match John to win the gold in the summer of 2006, Edge would introduce his own version in the form of the Rated R title. What was this? Well, it was basically Cena's belt, except with a spinning Rated R logo replacing the WWE one. Yes, it doesn't win any points for originality, but that was never really the goal here anyway. No, the goal was instead to get kids to hate the Canadian even more than they already did. So to see him disrespect the champ and his personalized prize then, well, that just didn't sit right with the younger members of the audience. And this meant that every time he came out to the ring with gold, which was somehow even more garish and ugly than the one which came before, he'd be booed by the kids, even if a large part of the adult males were still getting behind him. Was it ironic that those same fans who'd hated the spinner belt design from before were now effectively cheering for it because it was on a different person? Sure. But had Edge gotten his way, his belt would have never spun in the first place. No, when he was first approached about the idea of getting a customized title, he went home and drew up a design of his own, one which looked a lot more similar to the classic Intercontinental strap. And the reason for this was that Edge wasn't a fan of the spinner design, as he felt it looked too childish and didn't fully represent what the world champion should be. But when he was told by management that his version would just be a slightly altered take on this, he was forced to eat those words and instead cart the rated R belt around with him every week. That said, not every customized title has been quite so controversial amongst both fans and wrestlers. No, on more than a few occasions, they've actually been very well received. And perhaps none of them are as fondly remembered even to this day as Steve Austin's Smoking Skull belt is. That's right, one of the earliest examples of the WWF title getting a character-specific redesign, the Smoking Skull belt was a hallmark of Raw during the late 90s. And that was because, for most of this period, Stone Cold was either the WWF champion or was chasing the title after having been screwed out of it by Vince McMahon. But while it's easy to compare this one to John Cena's controversial custom strap, what ultimately separates it is that, in true rebellious nature, Austin actually had it made up without the boss's knowledge. Yes, while the spinner belt had been a very carefully calculated merchandising opportunity, the Smoking Skull belt equivalent was something which Austin decided to create of his own volition after the Road Warriors suggested the new face of the company should have something which set him apart from every other champion on the roster. Of course, given it wasn't his idea then, once Vince McMahon saw it for the first time, he hated it, with the boss initially demanding Austin never use it on TV again. That said, once he realized how popular it was with fans, he'd change his mind, and so, between the summer of 1998 and the summer of 1999, it became synonymous with the rattlesnake. Hell, at one point it even became a key part of storylines, as when The Rock stole the title in April of the latter year, Austin went on a warpath in order to get it back. But what did it actually look like? Well, basically it was something similar to the Big Eagle world title design, except instead of featuring a bird spreading its wings on the front panel, it had, perhaps unsurprisingly, a smoking skull instead. And for the 90s crowd, this was about as cool as it got, meaning the company made a small fortune on selling replica versions of them. But even that wasn't the first time a world champion had gotten a customized version of the top prize. No, for the OG version of this, we have to go all the way back to 1990, the year the Ultimate Warrior dethroned Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 6. Yes, for the whole generation, fans had been wondering who was eventually going to overtake the Hulkster as the next top star of the WWF. And in April of that year, they finally got their answer, because it was then that the Ultimate Warrior was finally coronated as the champion. That said, in the spirit of his iconoclast character, Jim Hellwig chose not to walk around with the regular Winged Eagle belt after this. No, instead he'd put his own spin on things by changing up the color of the strap depending on how he felt each night. Sometimes this meant going with the traditional black, sometimes it meant powder blue, and sometimes it even meant going all white. Really, it was his choice to make because, for a while at least, no one was going to tell him what to do, as he was the undisputed king of the wrestling world. As time went on though, and it became clear fans weren't taking to the Warrior as a top draw in the same way they had Hogan before him, things reverted back to their old ways when the Hulkster regained the belt and his position on top of the card as a consequence at WrestleMania 7. But even if this would mark the return to a more classic version of the Winged Eagle, arguably the greatest belt design in all of wrestling history, it couldn't erase the fact that, for a while there, Jim Hellwig made the WWF title more eye-catching than it had ever been before, if for no other reason than because it looked like it had been ripped straight out of the Saved by the Bell intro. Of course, not every customized belt design has been created for the men, however. No, on occasion it's the women who get to make something special. And in terms of WWE, perhaps nowhere has this even been done in a more high-profile fashion than the time McCool became co-women's champions, complete with a split belt. Yes, between 2009 and 2011, there were few more prominent figures on the WWE women's roster than the pairing of Layla and Michelle McCool. Why was this? Well, with their characters ripped straight out of Mean Girls, they basically served as the prototype to later duos such as the Iconics and AEW's Tay J. And given how over they managed to get as the bratty bullies then, it was only a matter of time until one of them won the women's title. But when it came time to decide who was going to get that honor, management couldn't choose, and so instead they decided to have both of them win it. That was how, after beating Beth Phoenix in a handicap match on the May 14, 2010 episode of SmackDown, each woman held a legitimate claim to being the champion. And when they started fighting over the physical title backstage later on, they'd end up pulling it apart by accident, with this leading to them from there just carrying about half the belt each as they effectively shared their reign. Sure, it was all a little silly and unlike anything you would have seen in the men's division, but for early 2010s women's wrestling in WWE, it was better than most got. And given their strength was always in their character and promo skills, McCool were able to get the whole thing over for the most part, as they played the heels who always worked together to keep their joint title reign going, much to the annoyance of every other babyface on the roster. But what happened to the belt when they finally lost it, we hear you ask? Did it ever get repaired with some industrial strength superglue or a careful bit of cross-stitching? Well, no. Because after unifying the title with Melina's Divas belt in September of 2010, the women's strap would be formally retired, with it not being seen again until a redesigned and fully intact version was reintroduced in 2016. And as it happened, it was also around this same time that over in TNA, a very popular star of the Attitude Era, Jeff Hardy, was getting his own customized belt. What was this? Why, it was the Immortal version of their world title, of course. Yes, after his time in WWE came to a sad temporary end in 2010 following a number of drug and alcohol issues, the charismatic Enigma attempted to rebuild both his life and his career over in the Impact Zone. And at least for a while, this turned out to be a great move for him because following some further issues, which almost threatened to entirely derail his career there too, he'd get himself back on track for long enough to where in 2010, he'd become a member of Hulk Hogan's Immortal stable. But that wasn't all he was doing, because now, with a crew of legends by his side, Jeff also started rising up the ranks of the singles division. And this went so well for him that, at October 10th's Bound for Glory, he'd beat both Kurt Angle and Ken Anderson in a triple threat match to win the then-vacant TNA World title. Of course, for someone as unique as Jeff Hardy, though, the regular version of the top prize just wasn't going to cut it. And so, recognizing this, his stablemates presented him with a gift on the following episode of Impact, his very own custom-made belt. How did it look? Well, this one has split opinion, with its design being bright purple in color and featuring what appeared to be a version of Hardy's alter ego Willow on the front plate. That said, the champ seemed to like it, and that was why, as the weeks and months went on, he defended it with pride, taking on all challengers and sending them packing in short order. Hell, in January of 2011, he'd even go international with the belt when he took it to Wrestle Kingdom 5, and there successfully defended it against Tetsuya Naito. But alas, just a few days after this, the charismatic Enigma's time would finally come when Ken Anderson beat him at January 9th's Genesis pay-per-view. And following that then, perhaps mercifully, one of the strangest and most out there custom belts ever made would be retired as the original design returned to TV. Still, for as strange as this design was, at least it was made out of traditional leather, as was every other belt we've discussed so far. When it comes to our next entry though, well, that would forego any such barbarism, as when Daniel Bryan became the Planet's champion in 2018, he'd only used the finest hemp to make his. Why was that? Well, at this point, the American Dragon was fully leaning into his real-life environmentalism by playing a caricature-deranged heel who chastised everyone around him for killing animals and polluting the atmosphere. So refusing to have a belt made of leather since he was a vegan, he instead made up his own title, one made up of a hemp strap complete with oak plates. And this certainly was an eye-catching design, if nothing else, one which really sold his gimmick all the much more. On top of that, it only increased fans' desire to see him get beat, as they all wanted the classic design to return. So it was a euphoric moment then when, after a 5-month stranglehold over the main event scene, Bryan eventually fell to the might of Kofi Mania. And once Kofi Kingston got the pin over him in perhaps the emotional highlight of the night at WrestleMania 36, his New Day stablemates Big E and Xavier Woods were right there to award him the old version of the belt, complete with leather strap and gold plates. But what if you're a wrestler who isn't able to get the big moment by winning a world title? How do you make yourself stand out in such a case? Well, you can always do what Ted DiBiase did in 1989 when he created the $1 Million Championship. That's right, we're now getting into belts which were never officially sanctioned by the company they were in. Basically, it all started when, after being unable to beat Macho Man Randy Savage to win the WWF title at WrestleMania 4, the $1 Million Man decided he was going to make his own belt and simply proclaim himself champion. Of course, as far as WWF officials were concerned, though, there was nothing legitimate about such a claim, and that's why they never recognized the $1 Million Championship as being one of their own. Still, even if this was the case, it didn't stop DiBiase from parading it about week after week as he showed off his wealth and power to everyone who would care to look, with a strap made up of 3 large dollar signs encrusted with cubic zirconia. Hell, on occasion, he'd even put it up on the line against opponents such as Jake the Snake Roberts or Virgil, with it being the latter he briefly lost it to. That said, as the belt was never formally sanctioned, this title change was never officially recognized in the WWF record books, and so DiBiase was allowed to, in his own mind at least, keep on going with the lie. And it still wasn't formally sanctioned when, after years of being dormant, the title was brought back to TV numerous times, once for Ted DiBiase's own son in 2009, another time for Cameron Grimes in 2021, and perhaps most notably for the Ringmaster in 1996, someone who we think might have gone on to do some things in the industry after the fact. But it's not like this is the only prominent unsanctioned belt in the world of wrestling though, because around the same time the $1 Million title was being awarded to Steve Austin over in Extreme Championship Wrestling, Taz's frustration at his inability to win the big one would see him introduce the FTW title as his own. And with the FTW title standing for F the World, the belt fit right in with ECW's hardcore crowd at the time. But how did it all start? Well, that takes us back to May of 1998 as, after his scheduled world title match against then-champion Shane Douglas had to be canceled when the franchise got injured, the Human Suplex Machine got characteristically angry and accused Douglas of trying to duck him. So feeling like if he wasn't going to get the shot he deserved, he'd have to take matters into his own hands, the self-proclaimed uncrowned champ introduced the FTW title at that month's It Ain't Seinfeld show. And while in its original form this basically amounted to nothing more than a customized TV title painted orange and emblazoned with Taz stickers, it wouldn't be long before a newer version was made, one which told the world exactly how the Red Hook native felt about it. Still, even with a newer, more official-looking title now being commissioned, it didn't change the fact that this was not a formally sanctioned belt by ECW. So whenever Taz defended it going forward then, the company never treated this as legitimate. No, instead it would be left to the men involved in the match to work on the honor system and agree that whoever won would walk out the champion. And this was what led to Sabu briefly winning it in December of that year. Though to be fair, Taz allowed himself to lose the match here between the two as he felt he no longer needed the belt. Why was that? Well, by then he'd gotten his world title shot, and so now, feeling that he was being given the respect he deserved, he argued the FTW title had served its purpose. But of course, even when the strap was formally retired a few months later, it wouldn't mark the end of it forever, because decades later in 2020, it was brought back in All Elite Wrestling when the Human Suplex Machine, now acting as a manager to Team Taz, awarded it to his client Bryan Cage. And since then, it's gone through 2 other holders in the form of Ricky Starks and Taz's own son, Hook, even if it still isn't officially recognized by Tony Khan. That said, at least it's made it onto TV, the same of which can't be said for our last entry today, and that's Zack Ryder's internet title. Yes, back in the early 2010s, when Zack Ryder was using YouTube to get himself over with fans in a huge way, he attempted to capitalize on this growing popularity by introducing the WWE Internet Championship. The only problem with such an idea, though, is that it came from him and not Vince McMahon. And so as a result, the boss never really took a liking to it and never allowed it on TV. Sure, it was defended at a few house shows throughout 2012, and at one point, Michael Cole and Jerry Lawler even referred to Ryder as the Internet Champion on Raw. But as for the physical belt itself, that would never appear with him as long as any cameras were there. Still, if you want a chance to see what it looked like for yourself, all you have to do is buy a copy of WWE 13 or 2K14 is there. In the Create a Title section, you'll find a template for a belt which featured Ryder's face and logo, which reads Internet Champion. And if you happen to be at an indie show featuring Matt Cardona in 2023, you might even see him still carrying the belt around, still repping it after all these years, and proving that a good custom title will always have a fan base wanting to see more of it.